Good morning. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Eric Potashnik, the Director of the Center for Health Policy and a professor here in the Batten School. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody to our conference on the promise and challenges of precision medicine. The Center for Health Policy is a joint effort of the Batten School and the Department of Public Health Sciences and the School of Medicine. I'd like to also introduce our Associate Director, Carolyn Engelhard, and the Executive Director of the Center, who I do not think is here yet, is Ruth Bernheim. There are a lot of health policy centers in the United States at major research universities, but there are not very many that are jointly sponsored by a public policy school and a medical school. And this unusual collaboration gives us a distinctive vantage point. Our mission is to conduct nonpartisan, evidence-based research on healthcare policy, to educate the next generation of health policy leaders, and to inform public debate on the critical healthcare issues of our times. We very much welcome your participation in our activities, and we're really sort of getting off the ground this year. We have an external presence, and we welcome your ideas for future conferences and other initiatives. So let me say a little bit about the conference today that we began last night with Mark McCullen's terrific keynote. Some of the most exciting and consequential health policy issues of the 21st century lie at the intersection of medical science, public health, and public policy. And there are really few issues that illustrate this better than precision medicine. We have a great lineup today of speakers from industry, academia, and the policy community. Let me say a little bit about the topic of the conference to lay the groundwork for today's panels. In his State of the Union address this year, President Obama announced that he was launching the Precision Medicine Initiative, a bold new research effort to bring us closer to curing diseases like cancer and diabetes. The Precision Medicine Initiative involves an ambitious effort to amass genetic data on perhaps 1 million Americans in order to identify the genetic causes of disease and find new treatments that will target dangerous mutations. The president said, quote, "I want the country that eliminated polio and mapped the human genome to lead a new era of medicine, one that delivers the right treatment at the right time." Now, this idea of tailoring treatment to a person's unique characteristics is not new. If you need glasses, you're going to get a prescription customized for you. If you have an allergy, you're going to get tested to determine exactly what you're allergic to. If you need a blood transfusion, it's going to match your precise blood type. What is new and potentially revolutionary is that precision medicine uses 21st century technology to target the pathways that are specific to an individual's disease and drug response. Precision medicine is not a fantasy. In some areas of medicine, it's already here. For example, drugs are being used to treat a number of cancers that stem from genetic defects. I think there are two broad trends that have converged to provide a degree of customized treatment previously not possible. The first is the advancement of molecular biology enabled by affordable genomics. The second is the rapid progress being made in data analytics. The mapping of human genomes is permitting a more detailed view of people's genetic makeups. It took 15 years to sequence the first genome, and the project cost $3 billion, but after that, it only took a decade to bring the cost of sequencing one genome down to $10 million. The technology has gone so quickly, has advanced so rapidly, that today the cost is around $1,000 per person, and the results sometimes come back in a matter of days. At the same time, advances in data science, computing power, electronic medical records are allowing researchers to learn more about the health of populations and individuals. New databases increasingly provide real-time data from millions of patient records. Increasingly aggregated and searchable by physicians, the databases are beginning to enable doctors to target the treatment diseases in their patients based on the responses of other patients with similar characteristics. Of course, progress in medicine, as in any other area of society, always brings new challenges. Precision medicine needs to advance healthcare without creating unintended negative consequences. There are clearly many technical challenges that will need to be managed. For example, researchers will need to identify sets of biomarkers that best predict which treatments will work for different patients. There also need to find ways to standardize collection of data from hospitals and clinics around the country. But there are also some broader political, economic, and social issues that precision medicine raises that I hope many of our panels will touch on today. The first is perhaps managing expectations. Already we're hearing voices of skeptics saying that precision medicine is being wildly oversold and overhyped, creating unrealistic expectations on the part of patients and clinicians. As one physician stated, precision medicine implies that if you know somebody's genes, you'll be able to fit the treatment to them, which is reductionist. We're learning that there are a very large number of rare variations, more than people thought, variations present in 1 in every 200 or even 1 in every 2,500 people. In a political system that discounts long-term benefits, how do we sustain support for this research initiative over time when inevitably progress may be slow? Second broad concern that we may touch on today is privacy. The aim is to build a national research system immediately gives rise to privacy concerns. Now, of course, data research is typically scrubbed of identifying factors like patient's name and birth data, yet it still may be possible for hackers with information about a given patient's family tree to connect some of these dots. How are we going to prevent people from linking personal health data back to individuals? Third broad concern, of course, is cost. The $215 million proposed by the Obama administration is a start, but this investment is clearly inadequate if the project is to realize its long-term potential. Where will the needed funds come from? In an era of tight health scientific research budgets, investments in precision medicine needs to be fiscally sustainable and avoid robbing other valuable research and healthcare programs. Cost effectiveness is another concern. Some advocates are hopeful that precision medicine will save money over time through better diagnostics and treatment. This is not yet clear. Drugs that are developed to target a person's genetic or molecular characteristics are likely to be expensive. They may benefit a very limited number of people. They can perhaps be justified if the benefits for these patients are substantial, but they will be harder to sell if they only offer marginal benefits over conventional therapies. Another set of concerns has to do with access and equity. Some breakthrough drugs are staggeringly expensive. For example, a drug that works well for about 4% of cystic fibrosis patients with a specific genetic mutation has a price tag of $300,000 per year. Reimbursement from third-party payers, such as private insurance companies, public payers like Medicare and Medicaid, for these targeted drugs is likely to become an issue. Should these breakthrough therapies be available to all Americans immediately, or are we okay as a society with allowing differential access based on different characteristics? Another concern is public health. A key issue that has to be asked is, where is the public health benefit from precision medicine? Will precision medicine reduce morbidity and mortality? If not, what level of social investment does it warrant? Evidence, medical evidence. Sometimes genomic tests enter clinical practice with little evidence to support their clinical utility or cost effectiveness. How are we going to gather this evidence? Will we use Medicare coverage with evidence development, for example? Treatment guidelines and recommendations can generate controversies with patients groups and physicians sometimes on one side and researchers on the other. How do we avoid the politicization of medical evidence around precision medicine? How do we maintain bipartisan support for this initiative in an era of political polarization? And finally, support systems. If precision medicine approaches to become a routine part of healthcare, doctors and providers will need to know more about molecular genetics and biochemistry. They will increasingly find themselves needing to interpret the results of genetic tests, understand how that information is relevant to treatment or prevention approaches, and convey this knowledge to patients. What decision support tools will patients and providers need in weighing different treatment options? So those are just some of the many issues that I think we may be touching on today, and the panel will provide much more in-depth discussion of them. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague Carolyn Engelhard and the members of the first panel.
So, good morning, everybody. Let me just echo what Eric said, and thank you for coming. We're going to have a great day. Before I introduce my panel, I'd like to ask, who among us here is wearing a wearable, a fitness tracker, or has one at home? Okay. Welcome to the precision medicine generation. This will, UVA this year actually linked my Misfit to their database, such so that they could record how many steps I took every day so that I could get a discount on my health insurance. So today, you know, we wear these things and it tracks our steps, it tracks our sleep patterns. There are other wearables out there soon, if not already, that will measure our blood sugar, that will inform cardiovascular disease. So this is it. This is sort of the beginning. We hear about what precision medicine is, and it can be as simple as each of us learning more about ourselves and how to keep us healthy and how medical science can help us do that. So the first panel this morning has to do with the promise of precision medicine. And we have a very esteemed panel. Before I introduce them, let me just go over some of the rules throughout the day. So each of the panels has 3 experts, and we've asked them to give brief introductory remarks, about 15 minutes each, on the topic. What we'd like to do is have all the panelists have their time, and then we'll open it up for questions. We've got each of the panels throughout the day is 90 minutes, and so we have plenty of times for discussion. I know those of you who were here last night were a little frustrated perhaps because there wasn't more time to ask Mark McClellan questions, so we should have plenty of time today to enter into a discussion, and we encourage that and hope that will happen. That is the goal of this conference, is to have dialogue. So with that, let me introduce my panel to you. Over on my right is Mike Pacanowski, who's the Associate Director for Genomics and Targeted Therapy in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology at the FDA. You can read more about Mike in your program. Dr. Carolyn Clancy, to my left, is the Chief Medical Officer in the Veterans Health Administration and longtime Director of the Federal Agency Healthcare Quality and Research. I think we all know Carolyn for her years at ARC, and I still think I can still see your photo every time I go into the website there. And finally, finally, this is the order in which they'll be speaking. And then on my left, one over, is Professor Stephen Schondelmeyer from the University of Minnesota, who is a professor of pharmaceutical economics. So you can see we're in for a real treat, and I would like to ask Mike to begin.
Would you like us to stay seated?
Yeah,
Okay.
if that's fine.
Sure. So, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's actually my first time in Charlottesville, so I think this is a gorgeous campus, and you all are very lucky to be here. I wouldn't say the traffic is much better than DC, but that's life in a college town, I suppose. What I'll talk a bit about, obviously, just given my background, is the drug development paradigm that we're currently in, mostly from a regulatory and drug development perspective. So I think we all appreciate that we've had significant advances in genomic technologies over the past decade. That's been said several times this morning and last evening. And this has really given us a lot of new tools to evaluate an individual patient's susceptibility to disease, their prognosis, potentially whether or not they're likely to respond to a treatment. And I think this really gives us a very unprecedented opportunity to begin personalizing therapy in a much different way than we used to. And there's been a lot of buzz about this lately, obviously, the Precision Medicine Initiative. You can't really have a talk anymore without citing something from the White House. But precision medicine, as it's been sort of promulgated by the White House, is really this holistic approach to patient care. It's not just genomic technologies necessarily. It's the entirety of an individual's health experience. And I think my favorite definition of personalized medicine or precision medicine is that of our former Deputy Commissioner, Steven Spielberg, who really just said, personalized medicine is one patient at a time. And in essence, that's really what it is. It's taking into account how far a patient has to drive to the clinic and all of that. But in more popular parlance, in recent years, personalized medicine or precision medicine has really been equated with the use of genomic technologies to guide medical decisions. So we've really witnessed quite a sea change in the technologies, as was noted, that we now have really unprecedented opportunity to do whole genome sequencing. We have a growing health informatics infrastructure, which is allowing a lot of new information to be available at the clinical interface. So it's really a very unique time in terms of the technological advances. But that also doesn't mean that we forget about all of these other things and just focus on the genomics. You know, being a clinical pharmacologist, my bread and butter is how much drug gets into the blood and how you dose based on that type of information. Whether you give a drug with antacids, how much drug doesn't get into the blood as a result of that, and how to manage those types of things. And all those are really what we come to know as sort of individualized therapeutic decision making. Now that we've come so far, you know, there was about a decade ago when we introduced these genome-wide technologies, we had these chips that allowed us to really characterize disease in a different way. And that produced quite a deluge of new information. And you know, from a historical perspective, looking back, you know, with all of this new information coming to bear, we were still in a paradigm where you had to order an individual test for a patient, which carries with it a lot of economic considerations. And the trepidation about advancing the science into the clinic was probably prudent at the time for that state of knowledge. We didn't have tests that had very large effects on disease risk. You know, for example, the number of genetic variations that increase your risk for diabetes only increase your risk a little bit, and nothing does better than family history and what you eat, obviously. So there was a lot of this argumentation about, you know, establishing the utility of a genetic test before it gets translated to the clinic. And I think now that we have these new technologies starting to creep in, we have to change our question and our reasoning a little bit. We'll have access, if we do a whole genome sequence or much broader information, access to all of this information at the point of the care. It's not going to be a matter of deciding whether or not you need to order a test and proving its worth, but rather, you know, it's a broader deployment of genetic testing and using that information as needed when it comes up in the clinical scenario. So I think we're in for an interesting few years. Now, this paradigm of introducing a test that provides much more information than you necessarily want also increases a lot of economic considerations. People only live in health plans for a couple of years, so why would any insurer have an incentive to pay for a several $1,000 test? And all of those types of things come to bear. But there is a societal question that we have to consider. So in saying all of this, I think my personal vision of where things are going in the future is really that, you know, each one of us in this room will have access to large volumes of genomic information that's portable, carried on our person perhaps, or recorded somewhere that can be taken from provider to provider. And this will have multiple effects. Number one, it will, you know, affect how clinical decisions are being made in the management of each of us, but also I think it could have very significant implications for the research enterprise. We're currently developing drugs in a paradigm where you develop one test and one drug at a time in parallel. And clearly with all of the genomic information and the ability to generate a large amount of information at once, that paradigm, you could see how it would slowly whittle away. You could have one test that provides all of this information, and that would allow drug companies to more readily identify patients who might respond to their therapeutics. It would ease the approval process to get drugs to those patients who may have a benefit. So it could simplify matters to some extent. There's obviously a lot of ethical and social considerations around that type of process, but nonetheless, it's a potential future state that we have to keep in mind. In addition, you know, the evidence that we rely on currently is from controlled clinical trials. And as we get into a paradigm where smaller and smaller subsets of a disease are being treated, we really have to consider what types of evidence are used for clinical decision making. I don't know if you've read Nord's report on you know, how we've approved drug and the quanta of evidence that have been weighed in decision making, but clearly we've approved drugs on as little as a handful of patients showing some type of clinical response. That's the direction we're headed in. Oncology trials are much different than they used to be 5 years ago. Patients are being directed based on what their tumor shows in terms of mutations. Phase 1 trials are huge. They're no longer these small studies that are studying maximum tolerated doses, but it's sequential dose escalation with really broad expansion. So it's a really different paradigm than we'd been operating in the past. So there is a lot happening right now, and I think to get to that vision, that state where we all have genomic information, there's going to be a lot of things that need to be in place. We need to, first of all, make sure drug development's leveraging, sort of the known biology. We have to have access to high throughput sequencing technologies and technologies that are reliable in the clinical setting. We need to consider development of biomarkers that help inform us about drug activity and response and safety beyond our traditional clinical outcomes-based endpoints. So there's really a re-engineering of the way we approach drug development and in this new paradigm. So, all that said, I think it's kind of important to consider what have been the successes. And in the past few years, we've obviously had a number of drugs that have been approved that have been a drug co-developed with a single companion diagnostic test. Most of these have been in oncology. There have been a couple in hepatitis C, although not co-developed with the test. The ivacaftor example in cystic fibrosis targeted a very specific subset of patients. So we have a lot of these new treatments coming to bear. And I think that if you look at these examples, there's a couple of things that ring true or common themes throughout them. And this is also evident in a number of companies that have gone and done pipeline analyses to look at sort of what the determinants of success for getting a product to market were. And these basically go back to things like having the right drug target, knowing what your drug target is and understanding the mechanism, making sure that drug gets to the tissue that you're actually targeting and doesn't have a lot of off-target effects. It's got the right safety profile so that risk is worth the benefit. You're getting it to the right patients, and in some of these analyses, obviously the right commercial potential weighs heavily on whether or not a drug can make it to market, although that's not obviously my concern. There have been some other analyses that have shown that, with all of this information we've obtained from genetic association studies, what impact has that had on drug development? And clearly there's been evidence that knowing that a particular biological pathway is involved in a disease process based on genetic association studies actually does increase the probability that the drug will successfully make it to market. So there is a lot of science and basic understanding of disease that we've gotten through use of these tools. And it is having an impact on the drug development process. So, from the drug development standpoint and looking at targeted development approaches, ideally the drug diagnostic co-development paradigm is something that starts from ground zero. There are a lot of companies that go into their early phase trials with a diagnostic hypothesis where they're testing determinants of response variability in a effort to potentially target to a specific population. That's not totally common, but there are a lot of companies that have that practice. Now, there are also many who do a lot of exploratory research in the early phases of development. This happens a lot, obviously much more in common chronic diseases where the genetic underpinnings might not be as well understood. And in those cases, there's exploration in early phase studies with a commitment to go down this path of targeting a therapy to a specific patient population more at the end of phase 2 junction after you have some clinical experience with the product. That's good, that's advantageous because it allows us to understand some of the potential for heterogeneity in treatment responses, but it also might have a high rate of false positives because in an early phase clinical trial, drug development context, you don't have a lot of data. So because of that, you're making decisions based on limited evidence, which is a challenging thing to do in a lot of drug development and co-development contexts because at present, drug companies have to partner with a diagnostic company. That's obviously a very complicated process. You have to develop 2 products under 2 different regulatory schemas, which makes things quite challenging. So, there's risks and benefits to both approaches. The other approach is, sometimes things crop up in the post-marketing setting. There are additional studies that might be conducted in phase 3 that show that certain subsets of patients may not respond. There may be something coming from post-marketing observational studies, and that's a difficult translational context because we have often not the best controlled trial evidence. Usually we don't have complete data. the clinical study design methods may not be the best to support decision making. So there, we really have to consider the quality of evidence and strength of evidence from a regulatory standpoint to make decisions that affect how a drug is prescribed. Now, with all of this, clearly we've had quite a bit of experience. We have a number of different guidance and policy documents that have sort of outlined the agency's thinking on personalized drug development. This initially dates back probably to 2005 with the publication of the Genomic Data Submissions Guidance and the development of a safe harbor, open discussion, non-regulatory, non-binding meeting context for engagement of FDA and drug sponsors. So, that's where we began, and we've come to a point now where we're in the process of developing International Conference on Harmonization guidelines on sampling of DNA in clinical trials globally. So we're working with EMA and PMDA on that. We have a diagnostic drug co-development guidance that's in process that will ultimately provide developers of both diagnostic and drug products greater insight as to how the agency approaches that type of information. So we do have a lot of activity in the guidance and policy arena moving forward. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of things that remains to be discussed. Clearly there's a lot of uncertainty as to how to accept and manage these large volumes of next generation sequencing data. We've had a few workshops on that. Clearly evidence generation for small subsets. We had a conference co-sponsored with UVA, with Bob, several months ago now, to discuss how we get clinical evidence for these very small patient populations. Laboratory developed tests are a very hot issue. How we approach regulation of next generation sequencing products is a major issue. And then as we get more and more products developed in a single space, how we harmonize the testing platforms across different drug development programs so that patients, when they get to the clinic, can get the same test results across different laboratories. So with all of that said, I think maybe a couple of the key take-home points are that drug diagnostic co-development is something that's feasible. It's really grounded in a very strong scientific basis, and that's how the agency has viewed these things so far. We approach things based on evidence and the strength of evidence to proceed with a targeted development strategy. We obviously consider unmet needs and all the other various factors that are part of the medical context for developing a drug. And I think we have to keep in mind what the future landscape is going to look like. It's probably not going to look like what it is today. From a regulatory standpoint, we have workshops coming up on next generation sequencing and how the FDA is approaching that. So with that, stay tuned and see how it all pans out.
Thank you, Mike. So moving right along, Carolyn Clancy.
Thanks, Carolyn. You can imagine we're quite bonded having the same first name. First, I really want to applaud the Batten School for doing this. I think this UVA is exactly the right kind of place, and at a public policy school, no less. So you are to be applauded for that. And really for organizing the weather is just totally above and beyond. I'm working in VA for the past couple of years, so there's quite a few former military people, and that means many presentations start with BLUF, and I think it took me a few months to get what BLUF meant, but it was bottom line up front, and I recognized it as a technique. So I have 3 bottom line up front points. There's a huge amount of promise here, but the first point is that enhanced connectivity between care delivery and every aspect of cutting-edge science and discovery is imperative. That's not the case today, and I'll get more into that in a moment. The second point is nothing about me without me. It has to be participatory, and I think there's quite a substantial opportunity for academia here. And the third is, I think as a community we have an incredible responsibility to, I'm going to say publicize in quotes. I recognize that on the industry side that may be not feasible or practical, but certainly to learn from interventions that don't work. My concern is that too often that's a tree that fell in the forest and nobody heard about it. So on the first point, today, basic science and what happens in the clinic with veterans every day, where personalized healthcare, by the way, is getting your phone call returned in a timely and predictable fashion. And I would argue that's true in much of healthcare. They're pretty far apart. Now, what that has meant is, on the health services research end, it has been pretty hard to document an important effect of a number of genomic breakthroughs. So I'll just give you the example of the test that identifies those individuals who are most likely to have increased bleeding with the use of the most common blood thinner. Now, we have some other options, thank you, FDA, but the companies who made them. But for many decades, there was one, right, coming out of Wisconsin, from the sick cows and all that, warfarin. And you would think, given the chaos that surrounds a test that needs, a drug that needs a lot of testing and results get lost and so on and so forth, with fairly predictable results, which are not good, that this would have been an incredible breakthrough. And yet a number of very well done studies found a statistically significant but absolutely not clinically meaningful difference between the intervention and the control arms of the study, because healthcare delivery is fairly chaotic. So that's what I mean by we need to be thinking about an enhanced continuum from discovery through distribution through care delivery, and frankly from getting those signals back from the delivery system. That's the learning part. Nothing about me without me. So we've seen movies which are very, very interesting, and Mark McClellan, whose talk yesterday was quite wonderful, referenced surrogate endpoints for HIV drugs. What he didn't say, and this is not a critique, I'm just acknowledging, is that my recollection is that the FDA didn't leap forward on surrogate endpoints, as I would not expect academic scientists would not have either. This is not a government comment, but the activists in the community really, really insisted on this, and in fact they were downright rude and extremely noisy and astonishingly persistent. Now, that's understandable, right? And I think, quite honestly, quite laudable. I mean, if you think about it, that's an incredible contribution, which is not what was on their minds. What was on their minds is there's too many of us dying. And if you start to think about how we could tap that kind of altruism and passion and commitment, I think there's a real question about whether that has to be disease-specific and in the context of extremely severe illness and so forth. But there's no question that when you get to issues of privacy that Eric mentioned and so forth, you go a lot further if in fact you're partnering with the patients for whom this is all about. Now, that sounds easier to do. Who doesn't like that? Except it's potentially messy, it's slower, it's a very different way of doing business than traditional research, where like-minded people who use the same language all get together and have a wonderful time. And the learning from what doesn't work really has been on my mind quite a bit. I stayed with friends last night whose daughter actually has cystic fibrosis and overall has done quite well. She was born a couple of years ahead of the discovery of the genetic test, has had transplants, and really is doing phenomenally well right now, I want to say in her early to mid-30s, which didn't feel like was possible when she was very young. So that's a lovely story of happy medicine. I mean, she's now a little bit past what used to be the usual life expectancy for, or the highest life expectancy for people affected with cystic fibrosis. I think it's fair to say that the gene didn't really have a lot to do with that. The personalized part probably had more to do with transplants and physicians who knew her and finding a good care system. And in fact, I think it might be argued that the discovery of the gene allowed us to discover a lot about the disease long in advance of having these very targeted treatments. So I have known other people whose children were affected by cystic fibrosis where it would not have been discovered absent that gene. So that, it's a good thing to actually have a name for it. It really has not changed their clinical course at all because they have very atypical manifestations from what we classically thought was the disease. Another family member who tragically died of lung cancer about a year ago, not a smoker, couldn't be healthier. As one of my sisters said, she has milk with dinner. Just to recognize that she was an extraordinarily healthy person, a single mom of a teenager, right? And had quite a bad tumor. Right in the middle of it, they find out she's got a genetic marker for which we have discovered new drugs, and that's phenomenal. And it, I can only presume, was too late for her, but it was not successful. So that's a tragedy we know about, but I don't know to what extent that signal gets back to the people actually doing the work. I think there's probably a great deal to learn there about tumor volume and when is it that we should be using these drugs and so forth. So precision medicine will need customized, precision, personalized application as well. I'm going to shift gears for just a second and tell you what is going on at VA. Mark referenced yesterday a lot of million-something studies, and indeed we have a million veterans program. So well over 400,000 veterans have donated their material for genetic samples, and to say that we are rigorous about privacy would be an understatement. I know this because I'm now the institutional official at central office for these kinds of things, in addition to many other parts of my day job. And what's really phenomenal is, of course, we have their healthcare information in electronic records. Now, we don't necessarily have all of their healthcare information, and I've not looked at a distribution because about 80% of veterans actually have some kind of other insurance. Medicare would be the most common, and to some extent, when electronic records are really easy and slick and actually fun to use all the time, and we share information easily, then we will have all the information, but it's unknown how much of their care we actually have, but we're probably a huge quantum leap ahead of most in having genetic information as well as their clinical information. So I was in Wisconsin about 10 days ago for a Disabled American Veterans Conference, about 150 veterans there, and I asked how many had enrolled in the Million Veterans Program, and I would say 2/3 of the room. So I said to them, all right, so a different question. How many of you have a chronic illness? About the entire room at this point. And how many of you have ever been treated for any one of your conditions with the first drug you were given, and that's been it? It's been smooth sailing. Maybe 6 hands. So that, I think, is one very important part of the potential promise here, right? We have almost no information on treating chronic illness. Because to bring a drug to market or other product, right, it's all about comparing historically, right? People who don't have people who have a very clear, well-established diagnosis, control versus intervention, right? Or a placebo versus the actual drug. And it's a short-term duration. I mean, that makes practical financial sense, right? It really does not help if you've been on and off Prozac or some other psychotropic agent for several years, and things don't seem to be going that well right now. So when I look at what's happening with the U.S. population, where what is arguably killing us, certainly costing us the most money, and where we often provide some of the worst care, it's chronic illnesses. I mean, these are the 20% of Medicare beneficiaries who incur a huge amount of the cost and so forth. So I think the opportunity to follow up what happens with people, not just for acute illnesses, but for chronic over time, and to know that we can actually reduce that trial and error is hugely important. At VA, we've also made big investments in the other aspects of personalized medicine that Mark talked about, the patient care teams. So some of you have heard of the patient-centered medical home. We, of course, call that patient-aligned care teams, but it is a system-wide phenomenon, and one that I think is very much part of the future. And what I did not hear mentioned yesterday, but arguably is part of this large panoply of stuff in the way that Mark framed it yesterday, is complementary and alternative interventions, about which we don't know as much as we should. We do have an institute now, and that's terrific. Very, very difficult to find comparative studies comparing allopathic interventions with complementary interventions. We're going to take a crack at this this year, looking at pain management, because I think there are some huge opportunities as we recognize very broadly that America's got a problem both with pain and with the unsafe and sometimes inappropriate use of opioids to manage that pain. But that's going to be very, very difficult. And we also have the opportunity for telehealth, which we probably have the biggest footprint in the nation, if not the world, which I think is quite phenomenal and really does change the game, as well as point-of-care studies. Now, this gets back to the connectivity again. A point-of-care study means instead of standing up a separate infrastructure for every single trial that then kind of goes away and people find new jobs or move to other parts of the university, whatever, when the study is over, what you've got is standing infrastructure that you take advantage of. And in our case, that's electronic records. So we're about to launch the first study. And just to give you a ballpark idea of what this means in financial terms, a clinical trial of this type would probably cost at least $120 million, if not more. This one we estimate will cost about $8 million. I think that's a little high on the data cleaning quality checks myself, but to get there, you've actually got to figure out how does this not interfere with daily workflow. We have a access problem, right? I mean, the last thing we need to do is have a bunch of clinicians saying, I'm sorry, you have to double the length of my slot so I can enroll people in this trial. It's got to be much more fluid than that, and that means on the research side, people have to say, okay, we actually don't need all of that data, because when you have a one-time infrastructure, right, it's astonishing how much stuff people come out of the woodwork to want. And some of that leads to important information, but you're already reading about the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute taking this direction, and I suspect we'll see more models of that as well. If I think about it, one question might be, why are we having this conference now? Because many of these developments have been emerging over time, and I think the real game changer is IT and cheaper computing power, because it makes many of the computations for genomics and other cutting-edge scientific developments feasible and practical and even cheap. And it also gives us a much better sense of what's going on in healthcare. Where we haven't gotten to yet, getting back to this idea of a continuum, is how do we make it easy? So reflect for a moment how many times you've sat somewhere and heard people say, oh, people won't enroll in clinical trials. Well, why is that? Some people are suspicious, may not trust, I got that. Mostly, I believe it's because we rely on the clinician who's pressured, right, to like move, because that's how we're paying now, for the light bulb to go on, for that clinician to then click online and figure out how does that match this particular patient. We could be pushing that information out in the same way Mark talked about yesterday, the way Amazon does, right? Here's your patient based on these characteristics. The following trials, X number of miles from this patient's home, might be a good fit. Here are the people to call, and so forth. So that's what I mean by greater connectivity. I think there are some huge opportunities here for academia. One is in the whole issue of, I have to say this, Eric, since you're a political scientist, consumer movements and activism. I don't think that we understand enough about that. There's a few, it feels to me, somewhat lonely researchers studying this, but I think we could learn a lot more, including how social media is a big part of that. Many people are finding that social media is a huge part of identifying adverse effects of treatment, because that's how people share information. I don't think we can ignore that. I think there's an incredible opportunity for new kinds of partnerships. We clearly need a new research model, right? My colleague referenced, as did Mark, how are we going to finance these studies? So I'll give you a very practical example. A few years ago, we actually was with Mark in tow. So he looks at this group of large employers and says, so are you going to finance all these studies where we need better information? He was at CMS at that time. And the example of bariatric surgery came up. Now, does anyone want to guess what the employer said? No, right? We pay too much for healthcare now. Actually, we're looking to you to lower costs. So could we change the subject here? And then finally, someone says, you know, if you build it into how we pay, we could do that. In other words, if imagine you want to find out if bariatric surgery works. That happened to be the example at hand. You would have an attachment to the bill. So we're paying by a case. I also want you to imagine how that would go over with academic researchers. I'll bet the clinical research organizations might be able to do something with that, but that's what I mean. We're going to need new models in academia. And I think the ethical issues and privacy, there were a few points yesterday when I must say I sat up listening to Mark speak, particularly in the predictive area. Yes, we can predict. But you need to ask me if I want you to predict. So that's going to be a big issue. One last point relates to clarifying terminology. So my friend and former colleague Rick Campanelli may remember this. We had the brilliant idea when I was at ARC of creating a distributed network, which we were calling, I believe, a National Health Information Network. And we did manage to fund a sort of prototype and work very closely with the Sentinel Initiative you heard about yesterday, because I do think that is very much a much more sustainable, trustable model. Where we got into trouble trying to advocate for a budget was that sounded just like what the IT people were doing, which had much more to do with architecture standards and so forth. We're going to be tripping on these terms all the time, and so to the extent that you can help the public make sense of it, I think that would be a huge contribution. So I will simply close. If there's one overarching point, it's that we need to be thinking about this as a seamless continuum from discovery through distribution to care delivery and back again. I think nothing about me without me. There's a huge opportunity for recognizing and encouraging and celebrating a participatory movement here, because this is how we're going to be getting information, or something like it, which frankly 8 or 10 years ago we did. Yes, you watch. I have not signed up yet, but I'll keep everyone posted. A lot of good points to do there, and please, we have to learn from what doesn't work. Just to close with a concrete example, 20% of prescribing today at least is off-label. It's legal. It's perfectly appropriate and often a really good thing, and absent a few altruistic folks who submit letters to the editor or post something online, we have no earthly clue. And that's just a drop in the bucket compared to what's going to be going on in the future. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Great, thank you. And now, Professor Schondelmeyer.
Greetings. I'm happy to join you from the state of Minnesota, where we haven't had snow yet, but it's imminently due. It's interesting as I hear the dialogue last night with Dr. McClellan and my colleagues on the panel today and the opening remarks. The first thing I would observe is that precision medicine doesn't have a very precise definition. And it seems to be, and I'm not saying this by way of criticism, but it's kind of whatever I want to include in the discussion is part of precision medicine. And frankly, I think from a public standpoint, a consumer public standpoint, if we don't sharpen that definition, the public will have a hard time understanding that. It will become more like preference medicine rather than precision or precise medicine or targeted to individuals. So we need to be a little more careful, perhaps, in defining precise medicine. And personalized medicine is sort of that way too. I do believe we have science that we can tailor specific understandings about an individual and how their body responds to diseases and drugs and other things. It's very unique to that individual, and it's very personalized, but that's different than, and we need to take into account personal preferences, but those are different than the science part that we bring to that. We need to learn to marry and combine science with individual preference. and to balance those two. But we need to realize they're different also sometimes. My overarching theme is, yes, we need to continue the discovery through science, but it's critical to realize that the value of the innovations we have isn't from the innovation itself. The value comes from putting it into practice and supporting it with public policies that encourage widespread and appropriate use. So the value comes when patients utilize and receive improved health benefit from the discovery. Yes, you must have the discovery to get there, but the discovery is not the end of the process. It's merely the beginning. Now, let me remind us that in this area of genetics, we sort of have a negative legacy that we have to overcome. To most people, genetic testing and counseling is a way to find out bad things you don't want to know. And the public views genetics in that way. And we've used genetic information then to penalize you in terms of the cost of your health insurance, your life insurance, whether or not an employer will even hire you. So we have this negative legacy of genetic information that we have to overcome. Now, the Affordable Care Act dealt with part of that. They said you can't discriminate in terms of health insurance coverage, but you can still be discriminated in terms of life insurance and employment and other factors. So we've got to get past this negative legacy we have from genetic testing. I think we can do that, but we have to very consciously do that and aim that very directly at the public, as well as scientists who have been involved in this process. So how do we build a positive future for genetics genomics? I think we continue to tell, and perhaps through patient stories, individual patients' experiences and stories, the experiences where we have identified a patient who has a propensity to a certain disease and their genetic markers helped us identify that and either prevent progression of the disease or more effectively treat the disease. And these wonderful stories that are out there will help us communicate that positive image. In addition to treating disease better and identifying the likelihood of a disease developing, we can also improve the safety with which we use therapies. We can know if a patient is a poor metabolizer of a certain drug. And if they are, and not all patients are, there's only a small subset sometimes that are, but it's important to identify that small subset because most of the labeling, until we realized pharmacogenomics were an issue, the labeling just had a standardized dose. The adult dose is 25 milligrams twice a day. But we realize now that for some patients, they may be adult, they may be similar size and weight, but they may have a genetic profile that says, no, that's not the standard dose, and that could be very dangerous. So this information can be used to help improve safety also, and we can tell some valuable stories in that way. But we also have to get that information out to practitioners and get practitioners to use it. Part of being able to use that information in a practical way, though, is having accessibility to the test. In Minnesota, with some colleagues, we have a big academic health center, much as you do here in Virginia. We have a fairly localized market in the Twin Cities that our university serves. And in that marketplace, we've started surveying employers and surveying insurance companies to identify, do they cover genetics testing? And what do they cover? Do they have an explicit policy or not? And we're finding that most employers and most insurance companies don't even have an explicit policy. A few may have 2 or 3 tests that they've agreed to cover, but if you look at their SPDs, the summary of plan description that every employer is required to have for their insurance program, it doesn't even address genetics, genomics, and testing, and whether or not it's covered at all, and if so, under what benefit design and what approaches. So I think we need to work with the payer community, the people who do pay the bills, the employers, the government programs, VA and Medicare and Medicaid, to make sure that we design appropriate coverage policies, appropriate benefit design policies, and that they're widely distributed. And then once they have those, they need to post those on their website so that their consumers can find them. Again, we've had great difficulty, and occasionally we'll find an insurance company says, oh yeah, we do cover that, but it's on a case-by-case basis, and we can't tell you ahead of time what will be covered. So it's sort of a personalized coverage process, if you will. You get my point there, okay. And or denial, yes. So that's my first perspective is we have to make this practical for the patient, for the provider seeing patients in a time slot that they have at the VA. I only have, 7, 8 minutes, 10 minutes per time slot. I have to be able to do all of this in that time slot. And then what we found from physicians in the community was, even if I want to order a certain test, where do I send it to get it done? And how do I know I'll get dependable, reliable, consistent results? And how long will it take me to get the result back? It may be weeks before they get it back in some cases. So practitioners don't know where to send this sample. What kind of sample do I draw? Where do I send it? How do I get the data back? And then when I get the answer back, how do I use it practically in a given patient situation? I do think in the future we will see pharmacogenomic clinics develop, much like we have, you talked about warfarin. We have, in many hospitals and health systems, we have warfarin clinics where physicians and pharmacists work together to dose the warfarin appropriately, or try to, in their patients. I think we'll see pharmacogenomic clinics, dosing clinics, where a team of physicians, pharmacists, nurses, genetic counselors, social workers work together to determine when it's appropriate to order information on genetics, how it's used in practice, how you use that to dose the drugs, how you use it to monitor drugs, how you adjust the dosing when necessary, depending on the metabolism profile or other markers in an individual. So I think we will see development of pharmacogenomics clinics. They're starting to crop up, but there aren't many yet. But I think will develop in the next 4 or 5 years rather strongly. And it fits right into the ACO, Accountable Care Organization concept of taking responsibility for that patient and their entire health, and not just, one service at a time, fee-for-service mentality like Mark talked about last night. The next issue that comes up, though, is how do we make this practical and efficient? If we leave genomics, genetics to one test at a time, okay, now this patient has a coagulation problem, we need to test to see if they're a fast metabolizer of warfarin, or if they have a psychiatric problem that needs citalopram, to test to see how that drug's going to work, or if they're on opiates and they're a fast metabolizer of opiates, and how do we adjust the dosing? If we limit it to one test at a time, it's very expensive to do it that way. It takes much more time. I think we need to step back and conceptualize genomics and say, can we make this a process that becomes routinized? Can we come up with a panel of SNPs, or maybe the whole gene sequence, but at least a panel of SNPs of 50 or 80 or 100, just like we have the SMA 12 and 6 on blood studies that you do routinely in a hospital. I think we need to do that with genetic profiling. Maybe at the time of birth, or at the coming of age stage for a young child, you do a genetic profile. And then how do we make that accessible? We want to make sure that if you move to another city or go to a different doctor, you don't have to repeat these panels over and over and over, and duplicative costs of therapy, which happens all the time in many other areas of clinical medicine today. I think there are practical ways to deal with that, though. I think back, again, I come from the drug pharmacy world. In nearly every state, we have a controlled substance prescription monitoring program, where all prescriptions for controlled substances by patient name and provider and date and time and pharmacy are all logged into a system. And any provider with a legitimate role in caring for that patient can look up that information and use it in clinical decision making. We could do the same with a genetic profile. Or similarly, immunization systems. In Minnesota at least, and I think many other states, have immunization registries, where again, when immunizations are provided to patients, it's put into a statewide registry. Providers with a legitimate care role for a patient can look up that information and use it, so we don't give them multiple immunizations. So we have systems already that we've dealt with some of these privacy issues. They're not perfect, but we have them and they're working. And I think we need to look at that for genetic profiles so we don't have duplicative testing in the marketplace. The next problem, if genetics genomics progresses to the area where we have individualized medicines that need to be made for a patient, for example, some type of antibody responses that would be made literally individually for a specific patient, then we need to look at a different model of how do we do that. If these are individual antibody response type medications, you can't mass produce that. You just can't. But I think, again, we have models already in healthcare and in medicine that help us with that. I think the best example there would be nuclear medicine. Nuclear medicine deals with products that have very short half-lives and very high risk and other things, and they're very uniquely tailored. But we have in most major cities in the U.S. Centralized places where they make a nuclear medicine, they deliver it on a just-in-time basis to a facility where it's administered to a patient, and it was made just for that patient, and it's administered within days or even within hours of the time that it's prepared. So I think we have models, distribution models, organization models that work, and I think we can do that with the parts of personalized medicine that require not mass production of therapies, but individualized production of therapies. So it is doable. There are practical models out there if we want to look at them and use them. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, we need to develop the process for coverage and reimbursement, come up with standardized approaches. Issues of what tests should be covered, under what circumstances, and the details. When genetic tests are they covered only for diagnostic purposes or for therapeutic monitoring purposes, or under what circumstances? Or some PBMs will require them, but only as a matter of prior authorization to get a drug, and that triggers, then now you have to do this test to get the drug prior authorized so that we'll cover the drug. So it's just when you talked about co-development of drugs and diagnostic tests, we also have co-approval of drug and diagnostic therapies, that they kind of go hand in hand in some ways. And that is another way in which we can get at reimbursement and coverage policy. If you're going to cover a drug, require the test, or if you're going to require the test for use of the drug, then we essentially have covered the drug. I do think there is great hope and promise of, as we learn more and more about genetics, that we may even find ways of curing diseases. While there's been a lot of controversy about the hepatitis C drugs, they do provide the closest thing to a cure that we've had since the polio vaccine, perhaps. And it's astonishing that we have that, and we're struggling with how to put a value on that as society, but no one argues the innate value of that, just providing a cure. But imagine if we started finding cures for other diseases, and I hope and wish that we can. Think about something like diabetes. If we found a genetic molecular basis that we could cure or totally eliminate a person's diabetes, then what happens to the market for other drugs to treat diabetes? What's the market for insulin do if we have a cure for diabetes? What's the market for oral antidiabetics do? That's all the more reason to find the cure, not to wait to find the cure. But I think sometimes we get focused on finding the treatments for chronic conditions rather than finding the cures and the preventions to stay away from those in the first place. We need to be advancing both of those. While we're on diabetes, I want to bring up another subject, though, and that is the cost of therapy does become a barrier. Particularly with insulin, between 2012 and 2014, the insulins went up, U500, Humulin actually went up 200% in 2 years. Now, when that patient's insulin goes up 200%, does that patient's diabetes get 200% better? No, it's the same drug, the same effect. What happens to the cost-effectiveness ratio of that insulin when the price goes up 200%? The cost-effectiveness ratio becomes half of what it was previously. We need to realize as we develop models of evaluation and cost that cost is moving rapidly sometimes in therapeutics, and we can't use a 6-year-old cost-effectiveness study and say the drug is still cost-effective today when the price has gone up at these kind of rates. So we need to have ways of updating and providing real cost and helping providers and patients make real value-based decisions. Without transparent, disclosed price information, you cannot make a real decision. I can't tell you how many physicians I deal with and talk with and ask, how do you make a value-based decision? And they'll tell me all kinds of things about safety and effectiveness and quality, and they say, I don't know the price. I don't take it into account. It's not in my decision set, and even if I wanted to know, I can't find out what the price is. You can't make value-based decisions without price. So we have to be able to work that in there. I do think we need more innovation, clearly, in the area of genomics genetics. I don't question that. I applaud, encourage that in ways that we can encourage that. But we also need innovation in value. And by innovation in value, let's look at the IT world a bit. A supercomputer back in 1975 would have cost about $5 million. Today, you can buy an iPhone for $400 that is more power than that supercomputer had back in 1975. So the cost structure is reduced by about 12,000 to 1. In pharmaceuticals, the average prescription price in 1975 was $5. Now, that's not the copay. That was the total prescription price in 1975 was $5. Today, the average brand name drug is $400 or $500. The average generics about $40, but the average specialty medicine is around $4,000. So we've had this escalation so that drugs have gone up 80-fold to 800-fold, depending on whether you talk about brand name drugs or the latest specialty drugs that are coming on the marketplace. This is putting pressure on our healthcare system in a way like we have never experienced before. And it's not, pricing isn't the real problem. It's the symptom. I think the problem is financing of healthcare today in general and balancing how much resources as a society we're going to spend on healthcare. And by financing, I always like to ask my patients this, and I would like you to contemplate this question. Imagine you've just come from the doctor. You've been told that you have a condition and you will die within 1 year, but we have just discovered a cure for this problem. How much can you afford to pay for it? So you need to contemplate, what is your life worth? What dollar value would you place on your life? And I would ask you to get a concrete number in mind. What is your life worth? Then I ask my students, how much do you have in the bank? Can you afford yourself? And often, the people who are honest about it will say, I expected and valued my life as worth far more than I have as resources. Well, in a sense, that's true of individuals, but it's also true of us as a society. Our expectations exceed our resources. I'm not criticizing that. It's a structural issue. We have to deal with that. And I don't think we, in medicine, deal with that very well at all today. I think we view this as a ever-growing pot that we can always just keep spending more and more. Do I think we'll ever spend less on healthcare? No. But we can slow the rate of growth. We can make sure we get more value for the dollars we do spend. We can be more effective and more efficient in what we spend. So I think we have to deal with the structural problem of how do we finance these therapies. We have therapies today that are pushing the envelope. Just the hepatitis C drugs and the multiple sclerosis drugs. I manage our university's health benefit, and we have 40 patients on multiple sclerosis drugs, and we had 15 patients on hep C drugs last year. Those two drugs alone, for 55 out of 40,000 patients, increased our drug budget 9.5%. The hep C drugs weren't even on the radar screen a year and a half before. So we suddenly had 5% of our budget go up for something we didn't have before. And the multiple sclerosis drugs have also increased about 5-fold over the last decade in terms of cost. So I applaud those. I'm not saying we shouldn't treat either of those. We should absolutely treat them. But we need to have a market that does help us come at actual affordable values. I noticed on the bookshelf back here earlier a book, and after I picked it up, I discovered it was written by our panel moderator, Carolyn Engelhard, and a colleague. And it says, Healthcare Myths, Half-Truths, Too Many Myths, Not Enough Reality. I think there are a lot of myths out there about genomics, genetics, and their promise. I wish we could realize all of them, but our job is to sort through them and say which ones can be reality and how do we get us there.
Okay, thank you. And just in full disclosure, my colleague was Tim Garson, whom we all know and love. So now it's your turn. I thank you for being such an attentive audience. I see a question already. So would you please identify yourself as you ask your question?
My name is Michael Swanberg. I'm with the School of Nursing. And actually, my question touches on something all three of the people spoke about. Briefly, it was my topic of research is healthcare disparities. And briefly, it was touched about the lack of information on minorities. It was brought up anecdotally, cystic fibrosis. And then what is a life worth was the question that was posed. So last week I was at the National Institute of Health, and they brought up that cystic fibrosis affects 1/3 of the people that are affected by sickle cell disease. So 3 times more people are affected by sickle cell. But the funding for cystic fibrosis is 400 times the funding. I was amazed, 400 times more money for cystic fibrosis than there is for sickle cell. So the question is, what is a life worth? And how do we build a system that doesn't continue that same ethnic minority disparities that we see today?
One way, I think, is through policies that anticipate that new developments and breakthroughs may actually inadvertently accelerate disparities. So I could imagine public payers saying, actually, we will be tracking the distribution of new treatments. We're trying to do this, or looking at this for hepatitis C right now within VA, because we know that some veterans from different backgrounds are actually more likely to have advanced liver disease, but there's no reason we couldn't be tracking that. You know, this would have been a kind of fantasy 10, 15, 20 years ago, actually quite feasible today. And we know from other studies that, in fact, when new treatments come on the market, that does not tend to be the way it works. Some colleagues and I studied a lot of this for the use of stents. And in fact, you tended to see that in more affluent zip codes, followed by other zip codes, a little bit of age bias, which may also be clinical good judgment, not sure on that latter point. So that's one way. I think the other area, getting back to the notion of studying and maybe in a participatory way, examining how consumers and families of patients get involved in some of these things. I think that there is an inherent disparity there as well. So some people might say that some diseases get more support because there's more organized push and advocacy. Why that is not entirely clear to me. Some of it may be related to socioeconomic issues. For one thing, it takes time to actually get involved in this kind of thing, and some people don't have that kind of time. If you don't have that kind of time, if you work 2 or 3 jobs. But I have not seen that analyzed very, very well. And rather than looking at why do we have differences, I'd like to know how could we figure out how to bring folks together. But those are my thoughts on it.
Quick comment. Some of the genetic markers we find do follow racial or ethnic lines as well, and so we do need to be aware of those and make sure that we seek appropriate clinical use and appropriate treatment when that occurs.
Jess?
Online activism and how that message is communicated online, and there is a market disparity in terms of, as Dr. Clancy mentioned, different groups who mobilize and can share that activist voice when we look at different diseases. So that's a follow-up point to that. But I also wanted to applaud Dr. Clancy's point just in terms of thinking about precision medicine across the continuum and that our precision therapeutics are only as good as our healthcare delivery system. So I think, when I think about my role as a nurse, one of the things that I think we have, just in terms of the scope of the future, is really looking at precision models of care. And you guys had mentioned the medical home model, but I think there's a lot in terms of not only the physical attributes of the person themselves, but also their social acuity and what the social context brings to it, and how we can really specifically look at delivery models that are precision focused, and so that the therapeutics have the best benefit. So that was just a comment, but I wanted to applaud thinking about it kind of on that continuum basis.
Oh, Don Detmer. One of the things that came up almost across the board was the challenge of meaning in language as we relate to these new phenomena. And then more or less, how in the world do we get communication, even among ourselves, let alone the greater public, so that meaning actually does come forward. Some time ago, I was contemplating working on trying to get just even a dictionary of terms in use internationally, because we have data standards, LOINC and so forth, on the IT side, but we're really talking about the words that sit on top of that. And we now have this platform, if you will, this basic architecture of ICT is now C's in there too, communication technology. But now we're talking about how do we deal with the data and meaning on top of that. And it seemed to me that even if we made that challenge, and maybe this is, I'm just kind of curious because you were talking about new models, if you think something like that could potentially be useful, where you just tried to track how, because clearly internationally, when I was over in Cambridge for a few years, I became so aware of how the world, the disconnect even with us at the world level on a lot of these things as well was complicating just being on the same page when you talked about these issues. Anyway, do you think that might have some value or not? But clearly, I'm trying to use this term data ecosystem, because we're trying to build a data ecosystem to sit on this platform of ICT, which is the infrastructure. But at some level, that becomes part of the infrastructure too. So I'm just trying to get to sense making in some of this. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So I think we have to be thinking about informations and communications technology, right? Because diseases are not just technical terms. They impact lives and the context in which people live and the activities that give them joy and pleasure. I mean, most of us don't get up every day to have a delirious healthcare experience. No matter how wonderful it is, that's merely a means to an end. And frankly, I think that we're missing a lot of that in healthcare right now, because the same smartphone that can be used to collect technical, very precise data is also the device on which I share how I'm feeling about this and problems I'm having with this particular treatment in a very conversational kind of way. And at a practical level, I thought Mark was going to go off into patient-reported outcomes, but it becomes very, very important there as we begin to need to develop that further in a way that doesn't annoy patients, right? No one likes to do the same questionnaire, and NIH has been building the technology of doing that more efficiently. But also to begin to understand what is the impact of these treatments on people's lives. So there's been a little bit of wrestling with that there. I don't think what we need is a Wikipedia of terminology, but I do think that we need to understand much more about it. Probably the one thing that's been helpful here is media, right? Because oftentimes when people are trying to figure out which version of Spanish, for example, you would use to enroll Latino participants, it turns out that broadcast Spanish happens to be a good standard and so forth, and kind of standard that people can relate to, but it's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important topic to discuss. You know, we've been working, you know, just at a glossary and terminology level. I mean, that is how we have to have a common understanding of issues to be able to have a dialogue at sort of the research and policy level. So we've been working with NIH over the past several months. We just had a Brookings meeting a couple a few days ago about sort of the definitions of a biomarker and different types of biomarkers. You'd be amazed at how inconsistently terms are used in the research community, and then sort of putting that into a regulatory context. And we're going to be potentially tasked with doing this as part of 21st Century Cures to come up with this lexicon, as well as evidentiary standards for each type of biomarker, and what type of evidence supports specific uses. But beyond even just the glossary, FDA has promoted standardization of clinical data that's submitted to the agency for quite some time. There's a lot of standards in place for that. This is being discussed now a lot, I guess, in the electronic health record community, particularly as part of the precision medicine initiative with NIH. There has to be interoperability of these data sets in order for researchers to carry out their work. I think that's a very important consideration.
I will just say, I don't know if you've read this, but talking about language and the importance of it and what it means and the social impact it carries, I think you probably read that John Boehner, as he was leaving Congress, wanted the patent on Obamacare. So, Gabe, you had a question?
Yeah, hi. I'm a computational biologist working in cancer genomics here at UVA. And I've taught personalized medicine in the medical school. And one useful thing to think about is really the individual single nucleotide polymorphism that's unique to a person, to a patient. There have been a handful of studies that have successfully found a variant specific to a particular patient using genomics, and they were successfully treated after medical odysseys, including medical odysseys that lasted 14 years, and once they found the SNP, they were cured within months. This is a handful of cases, but what it speaks, this is the extreme case that's useful to think about, is that really if you want to realize the full promise of genomic medicine, you're going from an evidence-based approach to a discovery-based approach. And the successful theme among all these studies is that they went through a procedure that was maybe reasonable. So for example, the challenge is we all start out, we all have like on the order of millions of variants that are specific to us, but you can whittle them down in very precise ways to one variant that itself could be associated with a pathway that's associated with the disease. So I'm wondering, to what extent are the procedures being considered to be standardized, as opposed to finding evidence in a clinical trial, which means you have to generalize to many people having that variant that could be treated, really standardizing a procedure in a series of databases, including pathway databases and disease databases.
So if I could maybe paraphrase a little bit the question. So the question is around optimizing the delivery of these larger, more costly omic types of tests to situations where they would have greater utility? Is that?
What do you do when, like, a drug is not approved? Let's say you have a gene that's upregulated in a cancer, but that gene is not associated with that cancer. There have been cases where that's been found through genomic approaches, but the insurance company won't pay for the drug because it's not associated, that gene is not associated with that cancer. That's just one example. There are other cases where a SNP was found in an individual. You could treat that individual, but insurance will not cover that because there's no evidence, there's no statistics, there's no clinical trial.
Yeah, I think.
But the procedures are very powerful and reasonable.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to look at that. So the patients that end up at the end of a diagnostic odyssey and then undergo these next generation sequencing tests, a lot of that's being supported by, I believe, by NIH's Undiagnosed Diseases program via NHGRI. So they do actually support the testing. I'm probably certain that there's some coverage of that type of testing for some very rare medically fragile patients who sort of need some additional diagnostic workup to understand what the etiology of the disease is. So that is happening, and then that does identify some drugs that the patient might respond to. In some cases, that's been investigational products, so there has to be coordination with the pharmaceutical company to get access to the drug for that type of use, but it also may rely on an approved product that is just not indicated for that. And I'm not sure how the coverage has been handled in those types of situations, but clearly that's a very discrete medical need category that's a lot different than the cancer example, which tumors across different tumor types all may express the same mutations. And I think we've been misled in some cases by the thinking that mutation operates in the same way in every different tumor type is probably not true. I think with BRAF V600, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in every tumor type. So the drugs that target that aren't going to work in every tumor type, and there's evidence to suggest that. So it's my understanding, having listened to a number of third-party payers talk about this issue, is they don't pay for research and experimental uses of medicines. Now, that being said, there may be justifications that are made, and that's sort of beyond my...
That was an issue I had on my list and didn't get around to. I do think in this area, genomics, we need to work with defining what's still experimental versus what is a standardized procedure that can be helpful to patients. And in cancer, it's not totally resolved, but many insurers will cover various types of cancer chemotherapies that aren't FDA approved, as long as it's under protocol and it's being evaluated and it's a standardized process. So I think if the research community, the medical community, and the insurer-payer community would work together, they could come up with ways to cover those, even though they may not be explicitly FDA approved or something else. But you have to sort out the difference between truly experimental, I don't know what I'll find, but I'm looking, and you should pay for it, versus I know that if I look, I'm likely to find something and the patient will benefit. Those are very different. And I understand why insurers don't want to pay for all research. But if we have a process that has a reasonable probability of giving a good result for a patient, then we should be covering it.
Another question?
My name is Gay Worley. I'm a physician at the Department of Pathology. And my question is going to actually try to move a step before all of this. I understand the concept of discovery, distribution, and care delivery, and certainly reimbursement. And this is really based on treatment. But where there's a branch before that, which is really prevention. And what's the role that's being played here? But when you talk about value-based care, we really need to start with prevention and reimbursement for prevention. And I think for me, the hepatitis C is a great example. You can open any magazine, turn on your television, and within 5 or 10 minutes, you will see an advertisement for the hepatitis C medications. And in that regard, it's phenomenal because it is raising awareness. But what it's not doing is telling you transmission of hepatitis C. How does it occur? It's just telling you, here's what you do if you have it. And to me, this is also a critical part in this whole process, is prevention and early education, and not recognized today, still not very well reimbursed by the payers. Getting people into exercise programs, teaching them how to do exercise, that's not reimbursable. And I'm a little bit curious in terms of, what role does FDA play in this? What role do the drug companies play in this? This concept that they have all these advertisements out, but they're not talking about how to prevent some of these diseases.
You want to start? Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I think Eric touched on it in his opening remarks. I mean, all of the pressures in healthcare today is trying to move us outside of the clinical realm into the social realm, and we call this now population health. We're trying to talk about how do we hold hands across that divide, and who pays for it, and how far back do you go. I don't know whose responsibility that falls under, but we'll ask the government agency first.
Well, so for some reason, I'm reminded of Einstein's sort of pacifist maxim that you can't simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. I think the same concept applies here, that obviously preventing disease is critically important, but there's not really a business there for the pharmaceutical companies, at least, to prevent disease. I mean, as a public health agency, FDA is obviously very interested in preventing disease, and those types of issues. The companies, as far as I'm understanding, as my understanding is of how the advertisements and such are regulated, there's no compulsion to increase awareness about disease and prevention. However, I do believe some companies do that as part of their promotional materials. Before drugs come onto the market, there may be awareness, and I think a lot of that awareness does stimulate a dialogue that wouldn't happen otherwise about people who don't have the disease. It's a way of not answering your question very effectively, but.
I mean, I guess, and again, this may be an academic challenge, how do we combine social marketing, which markets to and communicates to large groups of people, with the very salient and personal, wow, that's me, of what we see as advertising and so forth? I think many would say that some industry ads actually raise awareness in a very important way, particularly for issues that people are reluctant to bring up with clinicians. So some of the mental health medication ads, I think, are truly gifted. I almost wish we in clinical medicine had thought of that first, but I mean, it's a huge service. I don't know how we bring them together, but I think that actually trying to imagine that that's possible is far more enticing to me than reading commentaries that basically say resources are finite and we have to choose. Either we do public health. Now I understand the provocative aspect of getting your commentary in the New England Journal or wherever else, right? That's part of the drill. But nonetheless, I think that we are so far from that, really. We don't, that's a predetermined death sentence, if you will, to say we can't have this because we don't have that, when we could be imagining how do we bring them together.
I think the issue you raised touches on another important concept too, and that is how much does what we do in medical care affect health versus things that an individual does outside of medical care that affects their health. And how much does the individual either bear responsibility for, or how paternalistic can we be in telling them, thou shalt not do this, don't go to McDonald's, don't go, you know. So a lot of things that lead to prevention, not all, but a lot are behavioral and choices that individuals do make, and they're outside of healthcare. And I don't think within healthcare we've dealt with that. We don't barely even acknowledge it, let alone deal with it. All that said, if a drug company knew a way to find a vaccine that would prevent a major chronic disease, I think someone would go for it, even though others would go out of business. Like I said on the insulin, if you could find a cure for insulin, somebody would bring it to the market, and others would, you know, some would win, some would lose.
So I guess the one other thing I would say, Gay, is where it starts to get really messy and gets back to Eric's point about privacy is if we start looking at areas, particularly in neuroscience, about predicting behaviors. Now, on the one hand, that would be powerful information to have. On the other hand, that better be a participatory conversation. But if you think of a lot of our pressing public health issues, pain and opioids would be one. Why is it that some people go off on this path and others miss it altogether? But that's very, very challenging. Not beyond us, I don't believe, but challenging.
So great. Oh, one last question. We have 3 minutes. Secretary Hazel.
Just a comment, and I think Stephen may have nailed it, but I don't think we should be in the business of medicalizing everything, particularly things that are inherently cultural. And maybe we have to look beyond medicine and what insurance pays for, particularly when we get to prevention. I don't think that you can finance that through the insurance mechanism and make it remotely affordable, because we're not actually getting good value out of the current insurance mechanisms, in my opinion. As far as where it can be, and you know companies will do it, the HPV vaccine is an example of something that actually you have a vaccination that prevents cancer. And it is out there, and it is marketable and can be used. So there are ways for companies to get into that space in a fairly detailed way.
See, this is a good meeting.
I know, really. Okay, all right, I know. Okay, each of you get 1 minute, and then that's it. Then we got a break.
My name is Mani Mahadev, and I'm the head of clinical genomics here at UVA. I've seen people use the term cure a lot, and I just want to say that most things that we do in medicine we don't cure. So and I think that's a very important term. I deal with patients and families with muscular dystrophy, and they're always talking about cures. I always keep telling them about treatments. I think we really have to emphasize that word. Secondly, with regard to your comment about the cost of healthcare and what value it is, I just throw out the things that we do already in cancer for things like EGFR, PKIs, and BRAF drugs that the New England Journal studies show increased lifespan on average by 1 or 2 months at most. And what we tout them as these major discoveries, and the conversations with patients with regard to how much is that worth? And I don't know who's having those conversations. And thirdly, to the FDA, with regard to precision medicine, especially in genetic diseases. I'll give you an example, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where individuals have specific mutations. What is the role of the FDA in accelerating the development of drugs for individual patients? Because there may be antisense oligos, for instance, that might be useful in only 1 or 2 patients. Do they have to go through the entire regulatory process, or are there schemes in place, or are they being contemplated in order to accelerate the approval of such drugs for that individual?
Yeah, for the last point, I think FDA has exercised a significant amount of flexibility across the spectrum of regulatory requirements. There's a lot that goes into making a drug and putting it on the market, manufacturing and chemistry and distribution, and in addition to the clinical evidence and non-clinical evidence that supports its efficacy and safety. So whether the public would want those things softened, I don't think that would probably be the case. But that said, we have the Breakthrough Therapy Program, which was mentioned by Mark last night. That provides very proactive engagement between FDA and the companies to make sure that everything is brought into line to get those drugs to market as soon as possible. So we do, where there's unmet need and where there's potential for significant benefit, really do try to get those drugs to market very, very quickly.
So, Bob, you get the last word. You wait. Okay. Well, well, you can hold it for your panel that's coming next. So, thank you all for your attention. Please give my panelists a hand. We'll have a 15-minute break, and then we'll be back.